Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Hopelessly Gifted podcast. I'm your host, Mark Talaga. All right. So, today we're going to talk about a pretty big issue that I think a lot of parents out there and a lot of kids need to know more information about. And it's about labels and diagnoses. And so, I think, in today's modern world, mental health, the stigmas around it, a lot of that is disappearing to the point where kids, I think, honestly, are proud that they have a therapist. They like to talk about it. They like to know that they're being taken care of and they see it as a normal part of supporting your everyday health, which is great. And I encourage it. And with that, though, comes a lot more awareness into the world of labels and diagnoses and what people have and what that might look like for particular kids. And it's a bit of a double edged sword. On one hand, the purpose of labels and diagnoses is to create a sense of control that I know what is going on with me. I understand that the way I am or the behaviors I go through or the feelings I feel have a name. And there's a lot of relief in that. When I was going through my own mental health issues, for my whole life, having somebody label it as, hey, this sounds a lot like depression, where I had no connection to that idea that, oh, this is a thing, right, that exists for a lot of people and comes through in a lot of ways. Um, and there's a relief in that. And I'm glad that somebody was willing to say that to me. Or, this is what panic looks like or anxiety, and this is how it feels, and this is what it does to your breath, and this is what it does to your thinking. It can be extraordinarily helpful. The other side of the coin is when labels and diagnoses become your identity. That is who I am. I am autistic. I am attention deficit disorder. I am OCD, whatever, right? And when you start to own these labels as a part of who you are, rather than something that is in your physiology, it can become, for lack of a better word, an excuse posture, something you use as a way to say, well, I can't do that because I have this or I am this. And that's where it gets a little dicey. And this is where, our practice are big believers in really, really good assessment, really good evaluation, right? Knowing all the nuance of how your brain works, how you interact with the world, the sensations you experience, where it relates to the norm, where you're outside of the norm, and understanding that through the context that it is an ongoing process, meaning a diagnosis that you get at a certain age is not necessarily the end all be all. And while you may have to contend with whatever that diagnosis is for the rest of your life for a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's who you are and that's the only way you can interact in the world, right? So, one of the classics is you have an ADHD diagnosis and you get it when you're relatively young. Now, ADHD is interesting, right? We kind of have a picture in our minds of what it looks like, right? There's hyperactivity, they can't sit still, they're constantly talking or fidgeting, they can't seem to maintain focus. And then in other areas, they can hyper focus and, lose all sense of time. And, or you have more of the inattentive type ADD where you're just lost in a dreamy thought state all the time. You're not really paying attention or processing things. It's hard to get your attention, blah, 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 blah. And so we have this kind of societal structure that exists in the zeitgeist out there of what it looks like. And the issue is it looks different for everybody, especially the more complicated you are, the more complex your profile is, and the more things that you have going on can make it not so cookie cutter. And so what we have to always be dealing with is that there's an ongoing assessment and evaluation of specific developmental milestones and things we're trying to contend with and deal with. One of my, and this is probably going to push some buttons out there. One of my least favorite things is when somebody goes, well, I can't go, out in the world because I have social anxiety. Now, I don't blame them for feeling overloaded and dysregulated when they're out in the world. I've experienced that as well. But the issue is when you say that you have social anxiety, you are basically saying, I can't do certain things. I am not able to. And I don't believe in that. Not really. because yes, you might have to make some alterations. Yes, you might have to make adjustments to who you are and how you interact and have boundaries in place and have an escape plan in place if you need to get out of somewhere. But it stops development when you start to lean into it too heavily, or it becomes who you are. I can't do this, and so it's out of my world. And the quickest way to assess if there is potential for that to get better is when you ask somebody, does that bother you, even a little bit? Does it bother you that you struggle to go out in the world? And 9 times out of 10, you'll get somebody that says, yeah, it bothers me that I can't do it. And that tells me that on some level, they recognize internally that they have the potential to be able to do it, or they envision for themselves a way to exist in the world, but their mindset around it is so, I need other people to shift and change in such a way that I don't see that happening, and so I can't do it. Rather than breaking it down into like micro skills of what you may not even have a framework for in order to exist in a social situation, right? My mentor brings up a lot of the times where people are like, well, I don't want to go to the dinner party because I don't have anything to wear. And he's like, 9 times out of 10, you're dealing with that as an excuse of you don't really know what the rules are at like a dinner party. Where do I put my glass down? And how do I initiate a conversation? And what is my role? And what is the host supposed to be doing? And, how do I engage in a conversation? What happens if there's a lull? There's all these different scenarios that come up that go far beyond just, I don't have anything to wear, but more so a dozen or so micro skills that they don't have a framework for. And if they learn to develop it and make it authentic to who they are, so they're not putting on a mask and trying to be somebody else, although sometimes that may be the way you start to learn the skills is you pretend to be somebody else, right? You act as if, as the Adlerians say. But when you start to deal with all the little nuance and bits and pieces of what it means to develop your identity as a more sociable person that fits you, what you'll see is that it's not just, oh, I have social anxiety, end of sentence. It is, I have a dozen different needs that I don't know how to deal with. I don't have a framework for. And so I've just thrown the towel in on believing I can do it at all. And this is where labels can get a little dangerous, or just not maybe dangerous, but maybe limiting is a better word for it. And I don't want labels to be limiting. I want labels and diagnoses to be something that allows you to adjust in an appropriate way so that you can first differentiate yourself, set yourself outside of the norm and not put yourself into any sort of value system where the way you are is wrong. You realize that the way you are is perfectly fine. But yes, you need to make adjustments so that you can differentiate and then integrate, come back into the world, interact with the world in a way that makes more sense, in a way that has you feeling like you're building up skills in a way that you can handle anything. So, for me personally, like I'm a pretty weird guy. You might not get that from this podcast, by the way. And those who really know me, can't even believe that I talk so seriously about so many things because I'm not really a serious person when you meet me out in the wild. And I've learned that, part of me being weird is not necessarily tolerated a lot by certain people. And it's not that they're mean about it, but they can be, especially, kids when we were younger were brutal to me. But it was more like I had to learn that, yes, I interact with people in a way, or I try to look at things in a certain way that most people maybe don't get. And I have to learn to expect some of those reactions and know that I'm probably shaking up the way they see the world in general. And so sometimes, yeah, we need to shake people out of their normative routines and, chit chat and small talk. And I may want to ask them, what their favorite planet is or something, like where they may not have any framework for how to deal with that. And so they might reject it or shut it down or be like, okay, weirdo. But at the end of the day, I have to be the one to know that I have an impact on people in that way. Now, the other good news piece of it is my weirdness can sometimes free other people up. I've met a lot of people, especially in I golf in a golf league. Yeah, I know that's pretty normative, but I like to play the sport, and there are people there that a lot of people are like, oh, that guy's kind of lame, and he takes the game too seriously, and he's not really fun to play with. And sure enough, I find out that when I throw a little weirdness into the conversation, a little levity, all of a sudden they kind of play along, and they feel a little more free. And maybe that was in them the whole time, but they've been, drilled into their head that that's not how you're supposed to act, right? And so sometimes our uniqueness, our weirdness, our ability to create awkward pauses in conversations is a good thing. But when we get blindsided by it, or we try to prevent it from ever happening because we label ourselves in a certain way, oh, that's just, I'm ADHD, and people don't know how to handle it. We again, we limit ourselves and our ability to be authentic and natural with people. And my big belief in working with clients and kids and adults is to help them understand that they have to recognize their own impact. They can't just reduce it to a label. And too often, there are these, we call them armchair psychologists out there, people that don't really have a foundational understanding of psychology and diagnoses and assessment, that just throw labels onto people willy-nilly. And people accept it. Oh, I heard one little anecdote about your kid. Sounds like he's like my kid and he's ADHD. And have you tried B12 shots? And it's like, that's not appropriate. You don't know that kid. But too often we hear from other people their own experience in such a limited context that we start to get nervous or worried. Oh, what does this mean for me or my child or myself? And am I doing things right or am I doing things wrong? And again, the antidote is, do you have really good evaluation? And here's a good example of that. You know, a lot of times, autism gets diagnosed in kids at an early age, and sometimes very appropriately. And it is a very helpful experience for the parents to start to build in supports and structures for that kid so that they're a lot more taken care of in life, which is necessary. But how was that assessed? Was it done through a checklist where they asked a few questions, checked some boxes, and now the diagnosis is there? I don't think that's appropriate. Or was it done through a double-blind study where, there was a lot of research into it and there was a way to really understand, the autism diagnosis in a more complete, complex way? And most parents are afraid to ask that of the person, of the doctor, of the diagnostician, right? And so they just take what they get. And so I don't want people to be more educated in what the labels are. I want people more educated into what is your criteria for how you assess that. And then more importantly, I would say, is how do we keep the diagnostic window open throughout that kid's lifespan? Because things change and certain things look like other things. Language processing can come across as inattentive ADD, no problem. And all of a sudden, ADD meds don't work on that kid, or the side effects are too brutal. And turns out it wasn't ADD at all. It was a severe language processing disorder, right? And that's just one example. And so it's always about looking at the child developmentally and not saying this is what you have and this is what you're going to have to do and end of story, see you later, because that becomes too dangerous or limiting, right? Limiting. Although I do want to use the word dangerous because it can be. It can put a kid in danger, in a sense, a danger of not knowing themselves, a danger of believing things about themselves that aren't entirely true. One of the labels that I have, a nit to pick with is 2E, because 2E, for those that aren't familiar, it's twice exceptional, and it's applied to gifted children. The idea is, okay, they're 2E because on one diagnosis, they are gifted. They have high levels of intelligence or ability, or their developmental profile is way outside of the norm. And so, yes, they have giftedness. And then on the other thing, they have ADHD, or they have GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, or some sort of learning disorder. And that's all they are. They are gifted and they have a learning difficulty. They're gifted and they have a learning difficulty. They are 2E. If anybody has worked with gifted as long as I have, you'll know it's more like 10E, right? There's way more stuff going on underneath the hood that really paint a much more complete picture of what that kid goes through every day. And honestly, I'm still learning. In a future episode, I want to talk about primitive reflexes, which I'm just learning about now. That's actually quite a huge thing for a lot of kids. The general idea is the primitive reflexes that we're born with, how babies react in certain ways and newborns react in certain ways to certain stimuli, never really fully gets resolved. And so it continues to be a part of how they react to the world around them. And it comes across in a lot of ways that are a little bit different. Like they can't tilt their head back when they get their hair washed. It creates a distress. They put their hands up instead of behind them. And there's a lot of different physicalities that can be dealt with and worked through OT and other such interventions that can reduce some of that behavior. And so all of a sudden, it looks completely different. The child is starting to catch up in certain areas of development that stayed stuck for so long. And I guarantee you, most of you out there don't know about this primitive reflex stuff, right? Because I'm just learning about it. And I've been doing this for 12 years. And that's where it gets so complicated that I don't think it's appropriate on any level to say, hey, this is what your kid is. This is what they have, and this is who they are, and end of story. It is way more complex, especially when you're dealing with complicated, asynchronous, neurodivergent children. Now, I do believe a lot of people get this and agree with it, and hopefully are nodding your head and along in the car, wherever you're listening to this right now. And if you are, then that's great, because that's where I want you to be. And I want you to feel like you don't have to run towards simplicity in understanding what's going on with the kid, because a lot of times we do that as a way to control the situation. No, kid, you're just rejecting your autism diagnosis, and you need to accept it, and that's what's wrong with you, and that's why you can't do these things. And I'm doing it as a parent because I believe this is what's going to help you. And sure, it comes from a place of love and support and wanting what's best for your kid. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, are you doing it because you need a sense of control over what's happening? And if you are doing that, or the child is doing that, or another doctor that is trying to assess you is doing that, that's not where I want you to be. That's not where I want anybody to be. Unfortunately, you have to run to the complexity of it all. You need more data, more information. You have to turn over every stone. Now, that doesn't mean I need every kid to have 10 different doctors, but I need them to have somebody who really understands the nuance of how the brain works and is looking at the nitty-gritty of what it means to understand learning difficulties in gifted kids. Because when you have that, you're going to have a much clearer picture. And a lot of times the challenge comes from schools, right? Schools have their own agendas at times. Or teachers will do, and this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, where teachers will be like, I think your kid has ADHD. Do you have any idea how inappropriate that is? That teacher is not a diagnostician. They did not go to school for it. Now, sure, they may experience a lot of kids that have that diagnosis, and they may learn a thing or two, and they can spot certain things, but so can I. But even I know, like, I'm not going to say I know what's going on with your kid with ultimate certainty, because that's not my role. I would rather you walk through a process where you really start to understand that better, right? And when you're in that process and you're learning more and more things start to make sense. More things start to click. More aha moments happen. It's my favorite thing that happens when I first meet with parents in an initial consult at our practice. When I start to add more information, or when I start to say, yeah, and I bet he does this, and I bet he does that. And they're like, yeah, how did you know that? Because I've worked with these kids for long enough, but I'm also trying to tell you there's more going on. And I don't want you to reduce it to a single diagnosis or a label. And a lot of people that are older are suddenly going back for diagnoses. And then they kind of have this relief of, oh, now I know I'm gifted and on the spectrum, and I have ADHD. And then they just continue to live as they live. And to me, that robs a person of what they may need in order to grow into who they really are and how they really need to express themselves. And so I get very cautious with people around being too clear on, this is what I have and this is how it presents, and that's the end of it. It's more like, yes, you have something in the same way you might have diabetes, and your body doesn't create insulin in the way that it needs to, and you need to adjust for that. And you need to understand how important it is to take care of that, so that you are not limiting yourself to how you interact in this world, and that you do need to make some changes. And that's just a part of life once we learn about ourselves and who we are. So, I went through, this is a little personal story, but it was 2 or 3 years ago now, around springtime, where the best way I could put it is my brain broke. Like, I could not handle anything. I couldn't even go outside with my kids because everything felt so anxiety producing. I just felt like everything was doom and I was going to die at any moment. And somebody telling me, yeah, that's anxiety, or yeah, that's a panic disorder, it helped. But I knew that what was going on with me was something so much bigger because I just, I don't know how to put it. I couldn't understand that what I was experiencing was related to how much was going on in my life. It just didn't feel like that's what it was. I was about to take over this practice. I was about to become the man in charge. I've never done that before. I had no frameworks for that. Intellectually, I was like, yeah, I could do this. It'll be fine. But somewhere deep down, my body was freaking out and saying, this is not okay. You are not okay. And I tell you, I did every single thing I could. I got my eyes checked. I went to the cardiologist to check my heart. I talked with a psychiatrist to figure out what meds would work with me. I did genomic testing to make sure that the meds I was taking were actually being effective. And it turns out they weren't. And so that was a big save that I was able to find something that actually worked for me. And then I had to exercise like crazy because it turned out through the genomic testing that I have a mutation in one of my genetic markers in my brain that if I don't exercise to the tune of like 500 calories a day, my mood tanks. That's nothing to do with me or having willpower or anything like that. It was a broader understanding that there are certain things that I have to take into account and I have to adjust for if I want to take on bigger and better things in my life. Now, luckily, my story has a happy ending to where I was able to get things regulated again. It took a long time, by the way. It took many, many, many months before I was able to even feel like I could handle anything again. Luckily, all my clientele at the time were just unbelievably supportive and sweet to me during that time I took off. And, I had a lot of people in my corner, but I knew I had to go through the rigmarole to figure out what the heck was going on with me. And the funny thing is, if I hadn't gone to the cardiologist, I wouldn't have found out I have an enlarged heart and that I have unbelievably high cholesterol and blood pressure because of genetic factors. And no matter how well I take care of myself, if I didn't get on some level of medication, I could be at risk for stroke, heart attack, things like that. So to me, when you go through complexity and you've got to go through this very hopeless period that I don't know if this is ever going to get better, which is an awful place to be, believe me. But you stay in that process and you keep the diagnostic window open. You don't just close and say, okay, I've got it all figured out. Now I'm good. You've always got to be assessing, am I doing what I need to be doing? Do I understand what's going on with me? Do I really have a clear picture of what my needs are as an individual person so that I can go out into the world and accomplish the things that matter to me? And, I have a lot of expertise in this area, and I'm going to tell you what, it was still unbelievably difficult. It was still very, very hard for me to walk through that process and see my wife picking up a lot of the slack and struggling and not feeling like I could even be with my children, which, to me now is insane, right? I love being with them. But that's how bad things can get when you're completely out of your fit, and especially if you're taking on a lot of new stress in life. And what I could have done was I could have said, I quit my job and I'm going to go find something easier. And I'm just going to reduce my stress, which probably would have helped. But it wouldn't have dealt with the ultimate issues of what I needed developmentally to grow, even at age 38 or whatever it was. And that's what I want people to understand, that going through a process of evaluation is hard. And you're going to have people in society at large and the zeitgeist as a whole giving you quick fixes. Here's what it is. This is what you're dealing with. This is the problem. And unfortunately, it's just not going to work, especially with the gifted population. It's too complicated. There's too much going on. And what I like to see more and more is when parents are coming in with kids earlier and earlier, and I can help them sort out what they need to look for and what they need to assess for, and how there are certain things that developmentally we don't need to worry about. They're just behind in certain areas, and that's okay. And as long as I continue to grow my understanding of how the body works and what the body needs and all the different ways the brain works, the more I'm going to be able to meet that need of complexity. And so anytime you're with a therapist that you feel like, you know what, they're not really a good fit because they're dealing with too much of the symptomology and they're not really teaching the kid what they need in order to really grow and to understand themselves, you could see how sometimes that therapy relationship may not last very long because it's just not what a lot of people need. And so I work very hard to make sure the people at my practice learn how to assess for need far beyond the norm. And I want parents to start to say, hey, I'm not going to let something like bad grades get in the way of me understanding what my child really needs. Because it's not this, well, they're just being lazy or there's a behavioral issue. No, no, no. It's much more than that. Now, it could go in the extreme where I've, met some people in life that are like, any doctor tells me anything and I'm going to believe it and I'm going to give medication for it and I'm going to deal with it. And if they don't stop and say, hey, how did you evaluate that? Or where is that coming from? Or are you just guessing because you want to give me an answer? That happens. If you don't challenge that and have boundaries around that, you can get taken for a ride for a little while. The good news is I truly feel like that parents who are in that process and are really trying, when somebody gives them news or a diagnostic evaluation and they feel like it fits and they feel this sense of like, oh, that makes sense. And the more you're talking about it, I see how it's connected to here, here, and here. That's the feeling you need to rely on. We always say in our practice, and this is a little gendered, but you say, trust the mother's gut. If they feel like something is up, you meet them where they are. And you meet them at this place of they don't have everything they need yet because they're not at that place where it's like, oh, now I see. Now it makes sense. Now I start to see that there's more to this than I realize. And now all of a sudden, I feel like I have hope for the first time. And that's where I want people to be. And that's where I want people to get to. And it's hard to do all by yourself. Again, I'm an expert in this field, and I felt like I was drowning for my own sanity. And so I needed to rely on so many other people and so much support in order to work through it. So you're not alone, believe me. And for our kids, sometimes we get so scared for them because we don't have these answers. And we feel like they're going to not be allowed to be the people they were born to be. And it's a real fear. And my antidote for that fear is really going through that complicated process of what are we really dealing with here? And who are the people that are assessing, and do they really understand giftedness and asynchrony? And do they really understand the brain at the level that's going to give us those answers to where we all feel like things are making more sense? But again, if we're relying on diagnoses for some level of control over the situation, a false sense of control, or we're using it as a way to stay in a defensive posture where we don't want to interact with the world and we want to rely on the label as an excuse, we're in trouble. And we've got to break ourselves out of that in a way that is healthy and supportive and not judgmental and not this sense of, telling people that they're just flat out wrong. But it's a tricky needle to thread for sure. And so that's why I always, suggest help to people, suggest that they get more support and they get people to understand kids at this level. And, the truth is there's not a lot of people out there that get it. And that is a challenge. And so, my hope with this podcast is it creates more of an awareness on what people really need and to adjust for the variance that comes with working with gifted kids. And, there's other parents out there that don't really get it, or they treat giftedness with this idea that it's a label of, you know, power and prestige and, they can do anything they want. There's still people out there that believe that they're like, oh, your kid's gifted. That means they're going to be great in life. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe. And sure, that does happen. But for any of us that have actually experienced it and been in the trenches, we know that it's a much different scenario. And so today, I just hope that you get a sense of there's always more to uncover and that you have to be okay to stay in a process where you don't have that control. And in the meantime, while you don't have that control, it's okay to keep that kid supported in whatever way you find is working for them, because you understand that it's not going to be forever. It's not going to be this sense of, oh, I'm going to have to cut their food up for them for the rest of their lives. Not necessarily. But if that's where they are developmentally and their fine motor skills, who cares? That's my honest reaction. Who cares? Like, that's maybe what they need right now. And until you figure out more of what's really going on and why it seems to be such a challenge, you're going to have to be okay with, I'm just going to take care of my kid the best way that I possibly can. And what I'm still missing is answers. And I need to be okay going through that process and taking my kid through that process and having people who get it to support them and help, hopefully, get to that place where there's a greater understanding of their needs and their strengths and their vulnerabilities, and they get a complete picture of how that kid experiences this world. Thanks again for listening. This has been the Hopelessly Gifted podcast. As always, if you have any questions or something about this episode jumped out at you and you want to react to it, please visit us at hopelesslygifted.com. There's a little questionnaire place you can fill out to ask any sort of questions you may have, and maybe we'll be able to tackle it on a future episode. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.